Her name was Frau Troffea. No one recorded her first name. That's the first thing history takes from people like her, the personal part. The part that made her a person instead of a case. What we know is this. She was a woman in Strasbourg, a wife, someone's neighbor, someone who walked the same stone streets every morning, bought bread from the same baker, nodded to the same faces. An ordinary life in an ordinary city in the summer of 1518. And then one morning in mid-July, she walked out into the street near her home and began to move. Not purposefully, not joyfully. Her face, by most accounts, held no expression of pleasure at all. Just movement, rhythmic and strange. Her feet finding a beat that no one else could hear. Her arms shifting, turning, reaching for nothing. People passed her, slowed, stared, moved on. Because that's what people do with things they don't understand. They look, and then they decide it isn't their problem. But Frau Troffea didn't stop. Not after an hour. Not when the sun moved across the sky and the shadows lengthened. Not when her husband came to find her, grabbed her arm, and begged her to come inside. She kept moving. That night she collapsed from exhaustion on the street where she had started. The next morning she rose and began again. Strasbourg in the summer of 1518 was not a city at peace with itself. To understand what happened next, you have to understand what the city was living through before Frau Troffea ever took her first step. The harvests had failed, 2 years running. The kind of failure that doesn't just mean hunger. It means the future looks like the present, and the present is already unbearable. Disease moved through the lower quarters of the city the way it always moved through poor neighborhoods. Quietly, without announcement, taking people who couldn't afford to be taken. Syphilis had been spreading through Europe for decades. Smallpox returned with the seasons. And the plague, always the plague, waited at the edges of every city like a patient creditor. The people of Strasbourg were not simply poor. They were exhausted in a way that goes deeper than the body. The kind of exhaustion that comes from watching everything you were taught to trust, your harvest, your health, your prayers, fail you in sequence. And into that exhaustion, on an otherwise ordinary July morning, walked Frau Troffea. Dancing alone, in silence, in a city that had no idea what was coming. By the fourth day, she was still moving. Her feet were bleeding inside her shoes. People had begun gathering to watch in shifts, not helping, just watching. The way crowds gather around accidents because the mind needs to confirm that what the eyes are seeing is real. Her husband had stopped trying to pull her away. He stood at a distance now, watching his wife move through a crowd of strangers with the particular helplessness of a person who loves someone and has completely run out of ideas. On the fifth day, a second woman joined. No one could say exactly why. She was a younger woman, a weaver's wife, who had been watching from a doorway. And then, slowly, she was no longer watching. She was moving. The same rhythm, the same expressionless face, the same terrible momentum. By the end of the first week, there were 8 of them. By the end of the second, there were 30. The street near Frau Troffea's home had become something that had no name yet. The city council of Strasbourg convened on a Thursday morning in a stone room above the market square. Conrad Joam was the city physician. He was 54 years old, trained in Basel, a practical man who had spent 3 decades treating fevers and wounds and the inevitable damage of people living too close together in too small a space. He had seen a great deal. He had not seen this. He sat at the long table with the 3 magistrates who governed the city and a priest named Father Geiler's successor. The great Geiler himself had died 6 years prior, but his replacement carried the same certainty. And they looked at each other the way educated men look at each other when none of them have an answer, and all of them are expected to. "It is a sickness," Joam said finally, "of the blood, overheated blood. The movement is the body trying to purge itself." The priest shook his head. "It is divine punishment. The city has sinned. These women are the sign of God's displeasure." The eldest magistrate, a man named Heinrich Ingold, who had governed through 2 plagues and 1 flood, rubbed his face with both hands. "I don't care what it is," he said quietly. "I care what we do about it." That question sat in the room like something none of them wanted to touch, because the honest answer was, they had no idea. What they decided in the end was the kind of decision that looks like logic when you're desperate enough. Joham's theory, overheated blood seeking release, suggested a cure. Let the movement finish itself. Give it space. Give it music. Give it structure. The body would exhaust the sickness. The sickness would leave. Order would return. It was a theory built entirely on hope dressed up as medicine. But it was the only theory in the room. Magistrate Ingo signed the order on a Friday afternoon. By Saturday morning, guild musicians had been hired. A wooden stage was erected in the market square, the largest open space in the city, where grain was sold on Tuesdays and executions were held when necessary. The dancers, 34 of them by now, were escorted there by city guards. Gently, Ingold had specified. Treat them gently. The musicians began to play. And something happened that none of the men in that stone room had planned for. The music didn't calm the dancers. It invited more. Within 3 days of the music starting, the number of people moving in the square had doubled. Then doubled again. People who had only been watching found themselves stepping forward. Not all at once, not with any visible decision. Just a foot moving before the mind caught up. Then a hand. Then the whole body giving in to something that felt less like choice and more like falling. By the 3rd week of August, historians estimate somewhere between 200 and 400 people were dancing in the streets and squares of Strasbourg. The musicians kept playing, because no one had told them to stop, because stopping felt like admitting failure, because the magistrates were still in that stone room, looking at each other, waiting for someone to have a better idea. Conrad Joam walked through the square on a Tuesday evening and saw things he would write about in carefully neutral language for the rest of his career. People dancing with their eyes open but seeing nothing. People falling and rising and falling again with the mechanical persistence of something that had forgotten it was human. A young man, perhaps 17, sitting against a wall with his shoes off, his feet wrapped in cloth soaked through with blood, rocking back and forth, not dancing anymore, but unable to be still. A woman lying on the stones while 2 others knelt beside her, and all 3 were moving, even the one on the ground, her fingers tracing patterns against the cobblestones, in a rhythm that matched nothing anyone could hear. Joam wrote, "I do not know what I am looking at. I know only that it is not what I thought it was. He folded that page and did not include it in his official report. Father Andreas, the priest who had argued for divine punishment in that first council meeting, walked the same square 3 days later. He had expected to find sin confirmed, God's anger made visible. What he found was harder to reconcile with anything he had been taught. A girl of perhaps 12 years, the daughter of a cloth merchant he knew personally, moving through the square with the same terrible rhythm as the others. Her father was beside her, not dancing, just walking alongside her, his hand resting on her shoulder, keeping pace, talking to her quietly. She didn't respond. Her eyes were open. She kept moving. Father Andreas watched the cloth merchant walk in circles through the market square, with his hand on his daughter's shoulder, for the better part of an hour. He went back to the council. "We must stop the music," he said. Ingo looked at him. "And do what instead?" The priest didn't have an answer. He sat down. The music kept playing. The turning point came in early September. Not from the council, not from the physicians, not from any decision made in a stone room by men with theories. It came from a different direction entirely. Word had spread, the way desperate word always spreads, through the people who are suffering faster than through the people governing them, about a shrine. The shrine of St. Vitus, patron saint of dancers and those with nervous ailments, located in a monastery at Saverne, a day's walk from Strasbourg. The story that traveled through the dancing crowd was simple. St. Vitus could stop it. St. Vitus had done it before. St. Vitus was the only one who understood what the physicians and the magistrates could not bring themselves to admit they didn't understand. Magistrate Ingold, when he heard this, did not argue. He was tired. The city was tired. The musicians were tired. He arranged for carts. Over the course of several days, the dancers, those who could walk, those who had to be carried, those who moved in their rolling motion even as the cart moved beneath them, were transported to Saverne, to the shrine, to the priests who waited there with red shoes that were placed on the dancers' feet as part of a ritual of intercession, to rest, to silence, to an end that looked nothing like the beginning and everything like relief. By October, the streets of Strasbourg were quiet. Frau Troffea, historians believe, was among the first brought to Saverne. Whether she recovered fully, whether she returned to her husband, whether she ever walked past the spot where she first began to move and felt something she couldn't name, no record says. History gave her the beginning of the story. It kept the ending for itself. Conrad Joachim lived for another 18 years. He never published his full account of the dancing plague. The notes he kept, the ones with the honest observations, the pages where he wrote what he actually saw rather than what his theory required him to see, were found among his private papers after his death. In those notes, in the careful Latin of a man trained to be precise, he wrote something that his official reports never contained. We treated the illness we understood, and left untouched the one we didn't. I do not know if we helped anyone. I know we helped ourselves believe we were helping. These are not always the same thing. Magistrate Heinrich Ingold retired from the council in 1521. He was asked once, in his later years, whether he regretted the decision to bring in the musicians. He thought about it for a long time before answering. "I regret that we had no better choice," he said finally. But I don't know what the better choice would have been. That's the part that stays with me. Not the decision I made, but the absence of the right one. 5 centuries later, scholars still argue about what happened in Strasbourg. The theories are real, and none of them are complete. Some researchers point to ergot, a fungus that grows on rye grain, capable of causing convulsions and hallucinations when consumed in bread. Strasbourg's failed harvests may have meant people were eating grain that should have been discarded. The theory fits some of what happened. It doesn't fit all of it. Others point to what modern psychology calls mass psychogenic illness, the documented, scientifically recognized phenomenon where extreme stress moves through a community not as an idea, but as a physical symptom. One person breaks under pressure the body can no longer contain. Others, watching, feeling the same unspoken weight, begin to break in the same way. Not because they choose to, because the body, under enough strain, finds its own exits. Strasbourg, in 1518, had every condition that modern researchers associate with this kind of event: sustained famine, epidemic disease, religious terror, the specific medieval terror of a god who punished in ways you couldn't predict and couldn't appeal. People were not simply poor. They were living inside a story where suffering was proof of sin, and sin had no clear remedy. That kind of pressure doesn't stay inside the mind. It moves into the body. And sometimes the body does things the mind cannot explain or control. The third possibility, one that sits uncomfortably between the other two, is that what happened in Strasbourg was not one thing at all. That Frau Troffea may have broken under the weight of her own particular suffering, that others, watching, carrying their own suffering, found in her movement an outlet for something they had no other language for. That the music made it worse by turning a private collapse into a public permission. And that what the physicians and priests and magistrates failed to understand, what cost them 2 months and perhaps dozens of lives before the thing exhausted itself, was simply this: that they were looking at human suffering and seeing only a problem to be managed. Not people, not pain, not the particular breaking point of a community that had been asked to endure too much for too long, with too little reason given. Just a problem, with a solution, that made everything worse. There is a detail in the historical record that most accounts of the dancing plague leave out. During the weeks when the music was playing and the square was full of moving bodies, the city of Strasbourg also opened its grain stores. Quietly, without announcement, without connecting it to the dancing. The magistrates simply ordered that bread be distributed from the city's reserves to the neighborhoods where the affliction had spread most heavily. Ingold signed that order too. On the same day he signed the order for the musicians. The bread distribution was not recorded as a cure. It was recorded as routine civic relief. But the dancing plague was concentrated almost entirely in the poorest quarters of Strasbourg, among the people who had been eating the worst grain, buying the least food, living in the smallest rooms, praying the most desperately. The dancers who recovered first were, by several accounts, the ones who had eaten. No physician drew that connection in writing. No priest made the argument. No magistrate connected the 2 orders he had signed. But the bread went out. And slowly, across the hungry streets of Strasbourg, the dancing stopped. The last dancer, a young man whose name was not recorded, only his occupation, a tanner's apprentice, was brought to the shrine at Severn in late September. He had been dancing, or trying to, for 11 days. By the time the cart reached Severn, he could no longer stand. He was carried to the shrine on a litter. The red shoes were placed on feet that could no longer feel them. The priest who performed the ritual wrote in the monastery's record, "He wept when we told him it was finished." Whether from relief or exhaustion or something he could not name, I cannot say. I only know that he wept, and that it seemed right that he should. Frau Troffea walked out into a street one July morning and began to move. She didn't know she was starting something. She didn't know her name would be written down in a physician's notes, in a magistrate's order, in the histories of people trying to understand 5 centuries later. She was just a woman, in a city that had been asking too much of its people for too long. And something inside her finally ran out of ways to hold still. That's not madness. That's not sin. That's not even mystery, once you know what the city looked like that summer. It's just a person reaching the end of what a person can carry and finding that the only thing left was movement. The tragedy of Strasbourg is not that it's strange. It's that it isn't. It's that you can look at the conditions, the hunger, the disease, the fear, the failure of every system that was supposed to protect people, and understand with uncomfortable clarity exactly how a street in a medieval city could fill up with bodies that had simply stopped being able to be still. The question Strasbourg leaves behind is not what caused the dancing. It's why the people in the stone room looked at those bodies in the square and reached first for music instead of bread. And whether, given the same stone room, the same desperate choices, the same absence of certain answers, we would do any differently.